So it's working in that I can't push this static tree. Welcome back to Arcade. I am Super Tommy, and in this video we're gonna look at using ECS with Phaser 3 Arcade Physics Static Sprites. Now we covered normal arcade physics sprites with dynamic bodies in another video, in a previous video. Now if you want to look for that, go to the Arcade YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/arcade. And while you're there, be sure to subscribe for more videos like this on ECS and Phaser 3. And you'll find our set of ECS videos, including a 4-part series that goes into the basics of setting up an ECS system within Phaser 3 using BitECS, which is currently the ECS system used in the upcoming, for a while probably, Phaser 4. But just check our last video for using Phaser 3 and ECS for normal arcade sprites with dynamic bodies. In this video, we're going to look at adding static bodies. Now, if you've been enjoying this series or these bunch of ECS videos using Phaser 3, be sure to hit like on this video, and of course, again, subscribe to the Arcade YouTube channel. Now, I'm going to make myself smaller. So we're going to do a little bit of addition of environments, trees, environment objects, trees, to make as static objects, and then have our tank here. This is our player control tank that we did in our ECS and arcade physics video, so that you can move your tank around using arcade physics. We're going to have our tank run into a large tree and a small tree. So in our project, we've already pre-added our trees. This is the tree large, and this is the tree small. These assets are all from Kenny's top-down tanks asset. Go to kenny.nl, that's KENNEY.NL, for all sorts of great 2D and 3D game assets that are CC0, that's Creator Commons 0, that you can free to use for whatever you need. And there's that. Okay, so we have our trees in there. So let's actually add our trees. So we're going to add it the brute force way, and I'm only saying that, not there's anything wrong with this, but because that you'll see that there's some commonality we can kind of move out and make this better, let's say. Okay, tree large.png. Also, we've been alluding to it for several videos in this ECS set of videos, so we should probably just do it. So tree small, small, tree small. So what you can see here is we have these texture keys that we do have to remember to put over here. So, having the same thing multiple times just gives more potential room for error. So let's say we would want to do this, right? So that our texture keys array is going to work when we give it to our arcade sprite system or just our normal sprite system. We want to make sure that these things are up to date. So let's just do this so that you guys can read it better. Now, we could improve this by using enums like we've already been alluding to for a while. For example, we've left this comment here for the entirety of this series. So now let's actually use enums and show you how you can actually use enums for this. Let's come back up here. We're going to make an enum here. Let's call this enum textures, and it's going to be tank blue. That's going to be 0 or 0. Tank green, tank red, tree large, tree small. Now what you could do is like specify specifically what the number is, kind of like this, if you don't want to get confused, or you just want to see it better. This is a totally legitimate way. Of course, you can also then rearrange it and say this is 4 and this is 2. That would be fine too. But let's just do it this way. And then what we then do down here is we can do texture keys, textures dot tank blue. And so we don't have to rewrite that tank blue string again, or this, tank green, let's say tank green, and here tank grid. It's going to be tree large, tree small. Tank tree small. Right? So we're not going to have any typo errors, and whenever you want to use anything here, it's going to basically have to exist in here, or you'll get a runtime error more or less immediately since we're preloading these. Okay. Well, actually, I don't know if JS will give you a runtime error other than making this undefined. But nevertheless, and we can also then come down here and go textures.tankBlue. Get rid of that. Right, so you don't have to remember that 0 is the blue tank or 1 is the green tank. See, so this is a little bit better. You don't have to rewrite our strings all the time. Okay, back to the task at hand here. We're doing static arcade sprites with static bodies. So here's how we're going to do that. Very similar to adding arcade physics with ECS like we did in a previous video. We're going to create one new component and one new system. An arcade static sprite component and an arcade static sprite system. So let's come here. This is our arcade sprite component. We can put it in here. Let's just do that. We can also make a new file, but there's nothing that says we can't put it in here. So let's just call it arcade sprite static, and it's going to be the same. So we're just going to copy this. The properties in our component is going to be the same. It just takes a texture ID, just like the arcade sprite above it. So that's good. Let's go to our sprite system. We've got to make an arcade sprite static system, and it's going to be very similar to our arcade sprite system. So let's just copy it, and then we're just going to go through the things you need to change. Okay, so we just copied it. So arcade sprite, I'll just call it arcade sprite static system. We still want to take in a group, but this time it's going to be a static group. Static group, right? Since arcade physics has normal groups and static groups. So that's good. Same textures. Here it's going to be still a sprite. That's correct. Now, static sprites don't move, so we don't need velocity. And I think we're not going to rotate anything, so we don't really need rotation. So let's just keep it as simple as possible for now. Just delete the rotation as well. And here we want arcade sprite static. Okay. And so that's good. Arcade sprite static. So in our arcade sprite static system, any entity with the position component and the arcade sprite static component will be operated on by this system. And so now everything is basically the same except for when we loop through all of our sprites. Since they don't really do anything, we don't even need to do anything here. They're just going to stand still. Right? But one thing that could happen is that you can move your static sprites. So let's just say, given that is a possibility, we can do sprite.setPosition. And it's going to be the same as our initial setup for the enter query. Just do that. Given that our static sprites could just be moved, let's say that certainly could happen. You want to move your tree around, or whatever it may be. So we can just do set position in our normal query that runs every tick. Now the exit is the same as before. So now we have three systems in our sprite system file: the normal sprite system, the arcade sprite system, and the arcade sprite static system. Okay, so now let's go into game. Here we don't need to import the old create sprite system. Let's do create sprite static system, and we're going to want the arcade sprite static component. Cool. So let's now make some trees, shall we? Let's make a large tree over here. So we're going to do let's call this large tree. Add entity, this.world. So of course this large tree is an ID, right? We'll call this just a number. And we're going to do add component. We want a let's see, world, this.world. component is position, that's what I was getting at, and then large tree is the entity ID. And we need add component, this dot world, we want the arcade sprite static component on our large tree. And for the arcade sprite static texture for our large tree entity, so we're indexing in, we are going to want textures dot tree large. Right, so let's just see how that goes. Now we need another sprite system. This is going to be the static sprite system. Private, let's just call it sprite static system. We could rename this as arcade sprite system and arcade sprite static system. Just leave it like that for now. We'll go this dot sprite static system, create arcade sprite static system. Now we need a new group. Recall we changed it to take a arcade physics static group. So let's come over here, const sprite static group, let's say. Group. So this dot physics dot add dot static group. Oh, VS Code is blocking me. Dot static group. So we're going to pass in this sprite static group and the same texture keys. We're sharing those texture keys. Brilliant. So we have that. Now we want to update our system. So this is going to be the last thing that runs. So it doesn't really matter, I don't think, maybe for your game specifically it might, but it doesn't matter in our demo here whether we do the static ones or the dynamic ones first. So let's just do sprite static system. This dot world. Now if this syntax looks weird to you, this is just the TypeScript optional chaining syntax. So what this means that if this is not undefined, not null or undefined, then execute. Same for here. So that's it. So we pretty sure we go over that in our 4-part ECS series. So go to the YouTube channel and check that out. The arcade channel page. Check that out. Okay, we got that. That's updating. Let's see. Okay, so we have a thing here, and that is static, but it's not the right sprite. Let's just make sure we did the right thing here. Texture, arcade static sprite. We do need to, of course, set the position. Let's just make something up. Large tree. So if our tank is at 200, 100, let's just make our thing at 400. 400. And the one thing I think that we did mess up on is when we copy and pasted, which tends to happen, is we didn't update this. So this is our create arcade sprite static system, and we're getting the texture of a sprite, but that's not what we're using. We're using arcade sprite static, and in fact we probably messed it up in our previous video for doing, here's our tree, for doing the dynamic body. So that would be in our create arcade sprite system. This should actually be arcade sprite. Yep. So hopefully you watched that last video and then came to watch this video, so then you can actually see this correction, since it just happened to have worked given we're using the blue tank for our player. Okay, so here we have our tree. Now you're gonna see, of course, it's not gonna collide, right? It is static. That's the blue box around our tree, means it's static, but we have no collision because we haven't set up colliders yet. Now, just because we're using ECS doesn't mean Phaser 3's rules don't generally apply. We're still leveraging Phaser 3 for all of the like shared common game, the rendering, the physics, all that stuff. So what we need to do is create a collider in our scene like we've normally done in any other Phaser 3 game. So we have our two groups that are dynamic, the arcade sprite group with dynamic bodies, and the sprite static group with static bodies. So we can do this .physics.add.collider, just like we've done in any other tutorial here on the arcade YouTube channel using arcade physics and Phaser. We pass in the sprite group, and the sprite static group. and they will now collide with each other. So we don't, in this particular demo, we don't need to handle what happens in that handler. So we don't need to give it the process callback or the collision callback. So now, if we come here, it is stopping me from moving. You can see I'm moving. The green velocity vector is still going down. Now it's up. So it's working in that I can't push this static tree as I move my player around. So just for completeness here, let's also do a small tree, and it's going to be basically the same as this. Let's do that. Let's call this small tree. This is the ID, and we're going to add a position for our small tree, and it's going to index into the small tree. And let's just say our small tree, let's give it an x of 200, no, x of 300, y 200, let's say. Static sprite, great, small tree, and our texture is here going to be small, or tree small. And there we go. We have a small tree and a large tree, and they both work. Boom. So that is ECS with arcade physics for static bodies in Phaser 3. Now, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit like and subscribe for more videos on game development with Phaser 3 using ECS and other web technologies.